The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting the plains in pale gold, when Amara's day began with a familiar ache. The creaking of the farmhouse floorboards under her bare feet was a grim reminder of how fragile her world had become. Every sound, the distant crow of a rooster, the whinny of a horse, the soft murmur of wind through the fields, was amplified by the fear she carried inside, a fear that had grown heavier with each passing day. She had borne daughters in a world that wanted sons, and for that, her life had become a series of muted terrors. The marks on her arms, still faint but unhealed, burned with memory, but she concealed them beneath long sleeves, hoping the world would not notice. She had to. Her daughters, Rose and Lila, were too young to understand why their mother flinched when a voice rose too sharply, or why she sometimes broke down quietly after they had fallen asleep. The girls slept in a small room off the kitchen, their heads nestled against ragged pillows, hair spread like dark silk across the thin blankets. Amara watched them for a long moment, marveling at the soft rise and fall of their tiny chests, feeling both love and despair press down on her heart at once. How could a world be so cruel? How could people look at a child and see not a life to cherish, but a burden to bear? Every day, she fought against the shame her husband tried to inflict, the shame that seeped in from neighbors' whispers, the shame she feared she might someday believe herself. Her husband, Thomas, had once been a man she admired, kind in ways that made her heart flutter. But the births of Rose and Lila had hardened him. His disappointment in having daughters was constant, his anger a dark shadow over the house. He would shout at her for the smallest things, the way she dressed the girls, the way she fed them, the way she dared to smile when their laughter broke through the oppressive silence. There were nights when she bore the brunt of his fists, nights when she cried silently into the worn quilt, rocking her daughters as they slept, whispering to them that they were perfect, that they were loved, that they were everything. She tried to shield them, even as she bore the weight of her own bruises. Amara's life outside the house was no kinder. The town of Redridge was small, conservative, and unforgiving. The women, who might have been her allies instead, judged her quietly, offering hollow sympathies or sideways glances that cut just as sharply as a raised hand. "Girls will never bring honor," they would murmur when they thought she couldn't hear. "You should be grateful for sons." The words echoed in her mind, gnawing at her confidence, but she forced herself to rise each day, to smile at her daughters, to whisper affirmations into their tiny ears, as if speaking their worth into reality could somehow protect them from the world. And yet, in the midst of her isolation, something began to shift the day Silas Kane rode into Redridge. He appeared suddenly, like a ripple on a calm lake, and immediately drew attention. The townsfolk recognized him, a widowed cowboy who had roamed the West, carrying the ghost of a life lost too early, a man with eyes like storm clouds and a presence that demanded notice. But it wasn't his fame or reputation that caught Amara's attention. It was the way he looked at her, not with judgment, not with curiosity, but with a quiet understanding, as if he could see the bruises, both visible and hidden, that weighed her down. It happened on a Tuesday, the sun glaring hot against the plains, when Thomas's fury had boiled over. He shouted at Amara in the yard, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. The girls clung to her skirts, faces pale, eyes wide with terror. Amara's own voice trembled as she tried to calm him, but it was no use. Thomas's anger had taken on a life of its own. And then Silas appeared, dismounting his horse with a calm decisiveness that made Amara blink in disbelief. He didn't speak harshly or intervene with force. He simply stood there, silent but unwavering. "You don't deserve this," he said quietly, looking at her with eyes that seemed to understand every hidden pain she carried. The words, so simple, struck her with a force she hadn't felt in years. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had seen her suffering and acknowledged it without blame or condescension. Her heart fluttered against the cage of fear and doubt, and for a moment she dared to imagine that there might be someone who could help her protect the girls, someone who could see them as she did, not as burdens. but as precious lives deserving love and pride. From that day on, Silas began appearing quietly at the farmhouse. Sometimes he brought food, sometimes he helped mend the roof, and sometimes he simply sat in the yard while she worked, his presence comforting in its consistency. He never asked for more than he gave, never intruded on her life, and never judged her for the circumstances that had brought her here. Slowly, trust began to bloom, fragile and delicate, like the first buds of spring after a harsh winter. The girls, at first wary, began to warm to him, their laughter tentatively returning in moments when Silas played quietly with them, mimicking animals and making up stories that carried no scorn, no ridicule, only gentle wonder. Yet even as hope began to seep into the corners of their lives, the shadow of Thomas remained ever present. One evening, as the sky turned a molten orange, he returned unexpectedly, fury blazing in his eyes when he saw Silas leaving the house. The confrontation was inevitable. Words were exchanged, sharp and venomous, carrying threats that made Amara's chest tighten with fear. The old fear of being powerless surged through her, but so did a new, tentative courage she hadn't felt in years. Silas stood between them, calm and unyielding, and looked at Amara with steady eyes. "Then let me raise them proud," he said softly. The words were not a demand. They were a promise, a lifeline thrown to someone who had nearly given up hope. Amara felt tears prick her eyes, not of despair, but of relief and the fragile, flickering hope that perhaps the world could be different, that her daughters could grow up free from fear, confident in their own worth. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Amara believed that she might not have to fight alone. The promise of Silas's unwavering protection and guidance offered a path forward, uncertain yet full of possibility. That night, as she held Rose and Lila close, she whispered promises into their ears, not just as a mother, but as a survivor who had glimpsed hope again. The journey ahead would not be easy, she knew, but for the first time, she believed in the possibility of a life where her daughters could grow unafraid, cherished and proud. The journey away from Redridge was both terrifying and liberating. Amara rode in silence beside Silas, her daughters nestled safely in the saddle between them, their small hands gripping the reins of hope he had extended. The plains stretched endlessly before them, golden waves of grass bending in the wind, a vastness that mirrored the uncertainty of their path. Every mile they traveled carried the weight of fear and the fragile thrill of freedom. For the first time, Amara allowed herself to imagine a life where her daughters would not be judged for simply existing, where they could laugh freely, where their worth was measured not by societal expectation, but by the love and courage that had carried them to this moment. Silas proved to be a steady anchor. He had a quiet strength that Amara found herself leaning on, even as she resisted fully trusting another adult with her daughters' lives. He never pressured her, never attempted to fill the role of mother in her place. Instead, he built a framework for safety and growth, teaching the girls about the world in ways that nurtured their spirits. Rose and Lila were cautious at first, watching him with wide eyes, unsure if his kindness could be trusted, for they had known only anger and disappointment. Yet Silas had a patience born from pain and experience. He spoke gently, telling them stories of courage and hope, showing them how to ride horses with steady hands, how to gaze at the horizon and imagine endless possibilities. Slowly, the girls began to bloom under his guidance. Their laughter returned in soft, hesitant bursts, and then, as trust deepened, in full, ringing peals that made Amara's chest ache with relief. Even as the days unfolded, the shadow of the past remained. Amara's fear of Thomas, her husband, never fully dissipated. Every sound on the horizon made her heart lurch. Every rider in the distance was a potential threat. She knew he would not relinquish control easily, and she had no illusions about the danger that could still follow them. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky became a canvas of fiery orange and purple, her fear materialized. A figure appeared on a ridge in the distance, moving swiftly toward them with unmistakable purpose. Thomas. Rage radiated from him even from afar. His presence was a stark reminder that escape was never simple, that freedom was fragile, and that courage would be demanded in ways Amara had not yet imagined. Silas saw the figure before Amara did, his eyes narrowing slightly, but there was no panic in his stance. He urged the girls to hold steady, whispering reassurances that were calm, measured, and unwavering. "They cannot touch what they do not control," he said softly to Amara, though she could feel the strength behind the words. When Thomas reached them, his anger erupted like a wildfire. He demanded the girls be returned, claiming authority he no longer had, and trying to intimidate with threats and words meant to wound. Amara's stomach twisted with fear, but she felt a strange new confidence rising within her, a determination